I knew the HOA was bad, but I never thought they'd have the audacity to steal my car. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to make them regret ever messing with me. It all started when I moved into this neighborhood, a quiet little cul-de-sac with well-manicured lawns and an HOA that ruled with an iron fist. The president, Karren Billings, was a middle-aged tyrant with a superiority complex and a clipboard permanently attached to her hand. She ran the HOA like a personal kingdom, issuing fines for the most ridiculous infractions, mailboxes an inch too high, grass not cut to regulation length, even unauthorized holiday decorations. But the worst part, she had a personal vendetta against me from the moment I moved in. I wasn't the kind of guy to roll over and bow to some power-hungry HOA dictator. My name's Curtis Benson, and I've spent my life working hard to earn what I have. I don't take kindly to people trying to push me around, especially when they have no legal ground to stand on. It started small, passive-aggressive letters about my trash cans being out too early, warnings about my truck being too large for the driveway, despite my neighbor having the exact same model, and then straight-up fabricated violations. I ignored most of it, knowing she had no real authority, but then she escalated. One morning, I walked outside to find my truck, my perfectly parked, legally registered truck was gone. Towed, just like that. A bright orange flyer taped to my door explained the reason: multiple parking violations. That was a lie. A blatant, ridiculous lie. I stormed over to Karen's house, knocking hard enough to rattle the door. A moment later, she swung it open, arms crossed, her fake smile plastered on her face. "Oh, Curtis," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "I assume you're here about your vehicle." "You had my truck towed," I said, barely keeping my voice level. "Yes, well, repeated violations will result in consequences," she said, tilting her head like I was some unruly child. "You've been warned multiple times about parking outside of HOA guidelines." "What guidelines? I park in my own driveway," she sighed dramatically. "Your tires were touching the grass. That's a violation." I stared at her. "You towed my truck because my tires touched the grass." "It's in the bylaws," she said, smiling like she had just won some kind of game. "You'll need to pay the impound fee if you want it back. And of course, there's an additional fine for the violation." I clenched my fists, but losing my temper wouldn't solve anything. Karren wanted me to snap. She wanted me to fight her on her terms. Instead, I took a deep breath, stepped back, and gave her a slow nod. "All right," I said. "You want to play dirty, let's play." I didn't just want my truck back. I wanted to hit Karren and her corrupt HOA where it hurt. And luckily for me, I had just the plan. I wasn't going to let Karren get away with this. She thought she could push me around, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. Instead of wasting time arguing, I went straight to work. I needed information, and I needed it fast. The first thing I did was call the impound lot. They confirmed my truck was there, but the fee to retrieve it was outrageous, borderline extortion. They claimed the HOA had an agreement with them, which meant extra administrative costs were added to every vehicle they towed. That was the first red flag. Karren wasn't just enforcing supposed rules, she was running a racket. Next, I dug through the HOA bylaws. I spent hours combing through every clause, every fine print detail. Nothing in the document justified the tow. There was no rule about tires touching grass, no regulation that would have given them the authority to remove my vehicle. That meant they had violated their own policies, and I had proof. But I wasn't going to just get my truck back. I was going to make sure Karren's entire operation collapsed under the weight of her own corruption. I started making calls to other residents, to legal professionals, even to the city. I wanted to know just how deep this scam went. What I found was worse than I expected. Several neighbors had faced similar bogus violations, each one conveniently resulting in a tow. Some had paid up just to avoid the hassle, while others had fought back only to have their complaints buried under red tape. But the most interesting detail came from a retired contractor, Mr. Donovan, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. He had something that changed everything. He invited me over and pulled out an old file stuffed with documents. Among them was a land ownership record, something I hadn't thought to check before. The HOA didn't own the community parking lot. It had been privately owned for decades, leased out under an old contract. And here was the kicker: the lease was expiring in less than a month. That was the opportunity I needed. If I could get my hands on that property, I could turn the tables on Karren in a way she'd never see coming. I wasted no time tracking down the owner. He was an older gentleman named Richard Holloway, a former real estate developer who had long retired. When I explained what was going on with the HOA, he was more than happy to listen. He had no particular loyalty to them. He had only leased the lot to the previous board as a favor decades ago. And since the contract was up for renewal, he was open to new offers. I made my move. I didn't just lease the lot, I bought it outright. Every square foot of it. And just like that, I became the legal owner of the very ground Karren and her HOA relied on for community parking, board meetings, and most importantly, the impound access point they used to tow vehicles. Now, it was time to let Karren know exactly what she had walked into. The next morning, I had a contractor install a brand new gate at the parking lot entrance. I posted clear signs: private property, no HOA access without owner permission. Then, I went one step further. I contacted the impound lot and informed them that their contract with the HOA was now void since they could no longer legally use my property to tow vehicles from the community. The fallout was immediate. By noon, Karren was at my door, her face red with fury. She didn't even bother with pleasantries this time. She demanded to know what I had done, insisting that I had no right to interfere with HOA matters. I calmly informed her that, actually, I had every right. I owned the parking lot now, and I wasn't renewing their access. She tried to argue, but the facts were against her. The HOA had no legal claim to the property, and without their precious parking lot, they had nowhere to hold their board meetings, nowhere for guests to park, and most importantly, no way to enforce their towing racket. The realization hit her like a brick. She had no power here anymore. I let her stew in silence for a moment before I delivered the final blow. I had already contacted the city council and reported the HOA's illegal towing practices. An investigation was underway, and if they found financial misconduct, which I was certain they would, Karren and her little empire would be in serious trouble. She left in a huff, but I knew this wasn't over. She'd try to fight back, but it didn't matter. I had just taken away her biggest weapon, and soon the rest of her corrupt operation would crumble. Now, I just had to sit back and watch the fireworks. Karren wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. The moment she realized I had cut off their access to the parking lot, she scrambled to find a way around it. I expected her to retaliate, but even I was surprised by how desperate she became. The first sign of her panic came the next day, when a hastily printed flyer appeared on every doorstep in the neighborhood. It was filled with exaggerated claims about me being a threat to community order, and accused me of undermining the HOA's ability to maintain a safe and organized neighborhood. She even tried to spin it as if I had stolen the parking lot from the community, conveniently leaving out the fact that the HOA never owned it in the first place. Most of the neighbors weren't buying it. Over the years, they had grown tired of Karren's endless rules and fines. Some were afraid to speak up, but many were already reaching out to me, quietly offering their support. The parking lot scheme had affected more people than I initially realized. Homeowners who had been forced to pay unjust fines or had their vehicles towed without proper cause were eager to see her taken down. Then, Karren made her next move. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, which was usually held in the very parking lot I now controlled. Since they no longer had access, they attempted to hold it in one of the board members' garages, but it quickly became a disaster. Residents showed up angry, demanding answers about the illegal tows and questioning why the HOA had been charging absurd fees for years. The board was overwhelmed, unprepared to deal with the backlash. Word spread quickly that Karren had no good explanation for where all the money from the towing fines had gone. That was the crack I had been waiting for. I had already gathered financial records from multiple homeowners who had been forced to pay the HOA's ridiculous penalties. With the help of a lawyer friend, I compiled enough evidence to file an official complaint with the city, about financial mismanagement. If the HOA was found guilty of improper use of funds, the entire board could be removed. That wasn't just a possibility, it was now a very real threat to Karren's grip on power. She must have sensed the walls closing in because, the following morning, she tried something even bolder. A tow truck showed up in front of my house. I was watching from my porch when the driver got out, looking confused as he double-checked the address. I walked up to him before he could do anything. He told me the HOA had called him to tow my vehicle again, claiming it was in violation of community rules. I asked him to show me the paperwork, but he had nothing, just a vague order from Karren. That was all I needed to hear. I calmly explained that not only was this an illegal tow attempt, but the HOA no longer had any legal right to enforce parking rules since their previous contracts had been based on access to the lot. They no longer controlled. The driver, realizing he was being pulled into a mess, quickly backed off. Karren, who had been watching from a distance, stormed over, furious that her latest scheme had failed. She accused me of disrupting community order again, but this time she was the one out of options. I didn't even bother arguing. Instead, I informed her that the city had officially opened an investigation into the HOA's financial practices. The moment I said it, I saw the flicker of fear cross her face. She knew what that meant. For years, she had operated under the assumption that no one would challenge her. Her power came from intimidation and manipulation, but now, with real consequences looming, her confidence was cracking. Over the next few weeks, the investigation into the HOA's finances revealed everything I suspected and more. Misallocated funds, improper use of fines, and even payments to a towing company that had direct ties to one of the board members. It was all coming to light, and the residents were furious. The final blow came when the city imposed sanctions on the HOA, freezing their ability to issue fines until a full audit was completed. Without their ability to extort money from homeowners, the board collapsed under its own weight. Karren resigned shortly after, claiming she was stepping down for personal reasons. The truth was, she had no choice. She had lost control and everyone knew it. With the HOA's stranglehold broken, the neighborhood came together in a way I had never seen before. Homeowners started pushing for reforms, demanding transparency, and ultimately voting to restructure the entire board. The new leadership prioritized fairness over control, ensuring nothing like Karren's reign of terror could ever happen again. As for me, I got my truck back without paying a single penny, and I kept the parking lot just as a reminder that sometimes the best way to deal with corruption is to take away the very thing that gives it power. With Karren gone and the HOA in shambles, you'd think that would be the end of it. But power-hungry people don't just disappear, they find new ways to cling to whatever scraps of control they have left. And Karren, she wasn't going to walk away without trying one last desperate move. The trouble started about a week after the HOA overhaul. The new board was still settling in, sorting through the financial mess Karren had left behind. Meanwhile, I was enjoying the quiet, finally able to park my truck without worrying about it disappearing in the middle of the night. Then one morning, I noticed something odd. A group of men in work uniforms had gathered near the entrance of the parking lot. They had tools, measuring tape, and a clipboard. That alone wouldn't have raised any alarms, except for the fact that I hadn't hired them. I walked over, keeping my tone casual as I asked what they were doing. The man in charge, a wiry guy with a thick mustache, glanced up from his clipboard and informed me that they were here to assess the property for redevelopment. That was news to me. I pressed him for details, but he didn't have much to offer. He was just following orders, and his instructions had come from the former HOA president. That was all I needed to hear. Karren was trying to pull something behind the scenes. I sent the workers on their way, letting them know that whoever had hired them had no authority over the property. Then I went straight to work figuring out exactly what Karren was up to. It didn't take long. A few phone calls later, I learned that she had approached a local developer, claiming that the HOA was looking to reclaim the parking lot for a new project. She had pitched the idea that the community needed a new recreational space. conveniently leaving out the part where she had no legal ties to the land anymore. She was trying to force my hand, hoping that if I refused to sell, she could stir up enough outrage among the residents to pressure me into giving up control. But she had underestimated just how fed up people were with her antics. Rather than letting her spread her usual brand of misinformation, I got ahead of it. That evening, I knocked on doors, spoke to neighbors, and let them know what was going on. Word spread quickly, and by the next morning, Karren's little scheme had completely fallen apart. The residents weren't just against her plan, they were furious that she was still trying to manipulate things even after stepping down. Faced with overwhelming resistance, Karren had no choice but to back off, but she wasn't done yet. A few days later, I received an official-looking letter in the mail. It was from a law firm one I recognized as the same firm the old HOA had used. The letter claimed that my ownership of the parking lot was being contested and that the HOA was prepared to take legal action to restore community access. It was a weak play, especially since the HOA had never owned the lot in the first place, but it was enough to be annoying. I wasn't worried, but I wasn't about to let this drag out either. I reached out to my own lawyer, who took one look at the claim and laughed. There was no case here, it was all smoke and mirrors. But rather than just shutting it down quietly, I decided to make an example out of Karren once and for all. I filed a counterclaim not just to dismiss their bogus challenge, but to seek damages for harassment and legal fees. And since Karren had initiated this mess on behalf of the HOA, despite no longer being in charge, she was personally on the hook for the consequences. When she received the notice, she made one last attempt to bluff her way through it. She held a meeting, this time in her own backyard, trying to rally support for her cause. It backfired spectacularly. Only a handful of people showed up, and most of them weren't there to support her, they were there to demand answers. Why had she spent HOA funds on a legal battle she had no right to start? Why was she still meddling in neighborhood affairs? By the end of the night, she was completely cornered. It didn't take long for her to back down. She dropped the legal challenge, agreed to cover my legal costs, and finally disappeared from the neighborhood. With her gone for good, things finally started to settle down. The new HOA board made good on their promise to run things fairly, and the community slowly began to rebuild trust. As for me, I kept the parking lot not as leverage, but as a reminder. A reminder that when people try to take advantage of you, the best way to fight back isn't with anger or frustration. It's with strategy, with patience, and with an ironclad plan that leaves them with no way out. Karren had spent years using fear to control people. But in the end, the only thing she had been afraid of was losing control. And that was exactly what I made sure happened. With Karren finally out of the picture, the neighborhood was starting to feel like a real community again. The new HOA board had been making good on their promises, operating fairly and transparently. The ridiculous fines had stopped, and people no longer lived in fear of having their property targeted for petty violations. I had even started hosting informal gatherings in the parking lot I had purchased, giving residents a space to meet and talk without the specter of the HOA looming over them. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I could truly enjoy my home. Then one evening, I received an unexpected visitor. It was an older man dressed in a crisp suit with a presence that commanded respect. He introduced himself as George Holloway, the son of the previous owner of the parking lot. I had spoken to his father, Richard, when I had originally purchased it, but I had never met George. His expression was unreadable as he politely asked if he could have a moment of my time. I invited him in, curious about what he wanted. He got straight to the point. His father had passed away a few weeks ago, and while going through his affairs, George had come across the sale documents for the parking lot. He wanted to know why his father had sold it to me instead of renewing the lease with the HOA. I explained the situation in detail, laying out everything Karren had done. I told him about the towing racket, the fabricated fines, and how the HOA had been using the lot as leverage to control the neighborhood. George listened intently, his expression tightening as I spoke. When I finished, He let out a weary sigh and shook his head. He admitted that he had always suspected something shady was going on with the HOA, but had never looked into it. His father had mentioned wanting to sell the lot to someone who would put it to better use, and hearing my side of the story, George agreed that it had been the right decision. However, he had one concern. Before his father's passing, the HOA had approached him again, claiming that they were planning to take legal action to reclaim the property, arguing that it should belong to the community. George had dismissed it at the time, knowing they had no legal claim, but now that Karren was gone, he wasn't sure if the new board would attempt something similar. I assured him that the new HOA leadership was different. They had no interest in underhanded schemes. Still, George's warning stuck with me. If the HOA had been planning legal action before, there was a chance that remnants of Karren's influence were still lingering within the board. The next day, I reached out to the new HOA president, a no-nonsense woman named Alice Monroe. She had been one of the biggest advocates for reform and had played a key role in ousting Karren. When I mentioned my conversation with George, she was surprised but not entirely shocked. Alice admitted that when she and the new board had taken over, they had inherited a mess of old documents, some of which referenced strategic community acquisitions. Some of those files had related to the parking lot, listing it as a priority asset. She had dismissed it as just another one of Karren's half-baked plans, but now that I had brought it up, she agreed that it needed to be addressed. We decided to go through the old HOA records together. What we found was worse than either of us had expected. Buried in the files were letters Karren had drafted to multiple real estate firms, attempting to negotiate a sale of the parking lot before I had even purchased it. She had been trying to sell something she didn't own, likely hoping to secure a deal before she was forced out. The letters were never sent, but the fact that she had considered such a move was proof of just how deep her corruption ran. Even more disturbing was a financial report showing that HOA funds had been allocated for legal consultation regarding property disputes. That meant that money from homeowners had been set aside specifically to try and fight me for land they had no claim to. Alice was livid. She had worked hard to repair the HOA's reputation, and finding out that Karren had been planning something like this behind the scenes was a slap in the face. She called an emergency board meeting to discuss the matter. That evening, I attended the meeting as a guest. The board members were furious when they saw the documents Alice and I had uncovered. Some of them had suspected Karren hadn't been entirely honest about finances, but they had no idea she had been trying to manipulate property ownership behind their backs. The board voted unanimously to issue a formal statement denouncing Karren's actions and to conduct a full audit of past HOA dealings. They also agreed to implement new policies, ensuring that no future board could attempt something similar. With that settled, I decided to take things a step further. Since I owned the parking lot, I had the power to decide how it was used. I proposed officially designating a portion of it as a community space, free for residents to use without HOA interference. The board agreed, and within a few weeks, we had transformed part of the lot into a small park area with benches and greenery. It was a symbolic victory. The very land Karren had tried to use as leverage was now being used to bring the neighborhood together. As I watched families gather in the new space, I realized something important. This fight had never just been about my truck or the parking lot. It had been about standing up to corruption, about proving that one person could make a difference when they refused to back down. And as far as I was concerned, that was a win worth celebrating. With the parking lot now an official community space, things in the neighborhood had settled into a rhythm I could actually enjoy. The HOA, under Alice's leadership, had turned over a new leaf. Homeowners who once lived in fear of arbitrary fines and ridiculous rules were now actively participating in decisions that actually benefited them. It was the kind of neighborhood I had hoped for when I first moved in a place where people looked out for one another rather than waiting for the next petty violation to be thrown at them. But just when I thought the past was finally behind us, a new problem emerged. One afternoon, I was working on my truck in the driveway when a man in a navy blue suit approached. He had the polished look of someone who spent more time in boardrooms than out in the real world. He introduced himself as Daniel Whitmore, a real estate consultant. The moment he spoke, I knew something was off. He had a confident, almost rehearsed way of talking, throwing around words like opportunity and untapped potential, as if he were pitching me a business deal. He claimed to represent a group of investors interested in acquiring the parking lot. They wanted to develop it into something more commercially viable, though he was vague on the details. I wasn't interested. I told him outright that the lot wasn't for sale. It had become an integral part of the neighborhood, and more importantly, I didn't trust anyone who thought they could waltz in and reshape the community for profit. Daniel didn't push back immediately. Instead, he left his business card, saying he'd be in touch if I reconsidered. But I had a feeling this wasn't the last I'd see of him. Sure enough, a week later, strange things started happening. First, the new community space was suddenly flagged by the city for zoning violations. A notice appeared on the lot, citing obscure regulations that had never been an issue before. Then, a few days later, several residents received letters from an anonymous sender, warning them that the parking lot would soon be taken over for development. The letters claimed that anyone using the space would need to vacate immediately or risk legal consequences. At first, I thought this was just some leftover attempt by Karren to stir up trouble. But after some digging, I found out the real culprit, Daniel Whitmore and his so-called investors. He had connections in the local zoning office and had quietly pushed for the violations to be issued. He was also behind the scare letters, hoping to intimidate people into believing that the lot's days were numbered. His plan was simple: create enough chaos and uncertainty that I'd be pressured into selling. What he didn't count on was the fact that I wasn't the kind of person who folded under pressure. I got in touch with Alice and the HOA board, letting them know what was happening. They were furious, especially since they had worked so hard to rebuild trust in the community. Alice reached out to the city to challenge the zoning violations, while I started gathering evidence on Daniel's shady tactics. Then, I took things a step further. Using the connections I had built in the community, I reached out to my own legal contacts and got a zoning expert involved. Within days, we had enough proof to show that the violations were completely fabricated. The city quickly reversed their decision once they realized they had been manipulated, and Daniel's scare tactics fell apart. But I wasn't done yet. I tracked down the names of the investors Daniel supposedly represented and reached out to them directly. It turned out that some of them had no idea what he had been doing. When they learned about the underhanded tactics he had used, they pulled out of the deal entirely. With his entire plan crumbling, Daniel made one last desperate attempt to convince me to sell. He showed up at my house again, this time without the polished charm. He was frustrated, trying to frame his actions as just business. I didn't even let him finish his pitch. I simply handed him a cease and desist letter, drafted by my lawyer, warning him that any further attempts to interfere with my property would result in legal action. He left without another word, knowing he had lost. With Daniel out of the picture, the community rallied even harder around the parking lot. It became more than just a space to park, it was a symbol of what we had fought for. The final nail in the coffin came when Alice and the HOA officially filed a case against Karren for her past financial mismanagement. The audit revealed that she had funneled thousands of dollars into personal projects under the guise of community improvements. The legal case against her was strong, and by the time the dust settled, Karren was not only forced to pay restitution, but was also banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. With her gone for good and Daniel's scheme crushed, the neighborhood finally felt like it belonged to the people who lived in it, not to power-hungry board members or greedy developers. And as I stood in the newly renovated community space, watching families enjoy the place that nearly got stolen out from under them, I knew one thing for certain: no one would ever take this neighborhood from us again.